This animation was created using only 6 keyframes in Cavalry, and I want to show you how you can create it step by step. But before we can add this really cool layer that drives this animation, let's set the color to the following. And now we want to create the grid behind it, and for that we need a polygon shape. Then we can increase the sides to 6, and then increase the radius to something larger like 400, and you can hold Alt to change both values. Now we don't want just a solid polygon, but only the outside, so we can disable the fill color and then enable the stroke. And then to make it a little bigger, we can increase the width to 10. Then we can add a deformer called a bevel to add a bevel to the corners. Now for this animation we want 3 of these shapes, so we can duplicate it and then reduce the radius as well as the stroke width, which we can set to 5. And then inside of the shape we can also reduce the opacity to 80%. Now we're basically going to do the same thing for the next duplicate, that we're just going to duplicate this one more time, reduce the opacity, and then reduce the radius. Now then we can drag and hold over all of them and then change the rotation to 30 degrees. Then we can group them all together and call them hexagons. And now we're ready to add the lines as the last part of this grid. Then we can change the rotation to 90 degrees and then increase the length all the way up to 800. Now you will notice that they are exceeding the original hexagon we have here, and that's because of the bevel, but it's just nicer to have it at 800. So instead we can just change the original polygon shape to be a little larger in the radius. Then we can change the width of this to 5, and now we're ready for the color. And for this I sort of want this gradient in towards the middle, so we have to add a gradient shader. Now this is a little more complicated, but it's not too bad. What we have to do is double click here to add a new value, and then we can set it to 0.5 to have it in the center. Then with this new point selected, we can change the color to the same as the hexagon's stroke. And we're going to do this for all 3 points on this gradient. Now the only change we're going to make in the middle is that we're going to reduce the opacity down to around 130, so we can sort of see through. Now this change only really works if we change the base colors alpha all the way down to 0 on the basic line. And this animation works by having these circles move on the lines and then they create the shape. Now for making these ellipse shapes, we have a simple ellipse that we change the size down to 15. Moving this on the first line we have here is quite easy by changing the Y value. But when we have to create these other lines, it's not so simple, since the Y value only changes it up and down. And if we were to, for example, duplicate this line and then rotate it by 30 degrees, and now it has to move on both the X and Y axes. And this is actually not so easy, but I found a solution that is quite clever, I would say myself. And to do that, we need to have this basic line here that we then put inside of a group by pressing Ctrl G. Then we can rename that to, for example, line vertical. Then we can duplicate that group and change it to, for example, line top right to bottom left. And inside of this group, we can then rotate the whole group by minus 60 degrees. And inside the group, we can then select this line and then add a ellipse shape. So it's inside the group, and then change the size. And now if we change the ellipse shape's Y value, it changes on the perfect angle. And this is quite useful since it also has the same values. But before getting ahead of ourselves, let's delete that ellipse shape and let's duplicate it one more time to have the last group, and then rotate that to be minus 20 degrees. And now we just have the lines without the ellipse shapes. So we can select all of those and then call them lines inside of a group. Now for actually adding these ellipse shapes, let's go ahead and start off with the basic line vertical. Then we can select the basic line to make sure we're in the group, and then add a ellipse shape of 15 by 15. Now it doesn't matter that it's beneath some lines, since we're actually going to hide it at some point. Now, for changing these values, as you can see here, it would be nice to have some sort of control panel, so we can add what's called a value array. Now, inside of this value array, we can then go ahead and add multiple values. Now, for this animation, we want 6 values, and the reason for this is that if we count from the top, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, meaning 2 ellipses for each line. We can then drag the value of the first one down to our ellipse shape and then into the Y position. Then we can see we can now change the Y position, but problem is that it can move outside of its bounds. And this is actually quite easy to fix. We can just right click here and then edit limits, and then we can set a hard minimum and a hard maximum of 0 to 400. Now, this does not only just give us a value that can't exceed the bounds we set for it, but also if we go outside of this value array and then in it again, we can see we now have a slider, which is quite nice, especially for visually understanding this. Now, one ellipse shape isn't really going to do a lot for us, so we obviously have to duplicate that ellipse shape. And for naming these, we're going to do 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And for the first ellipse shape, we're going to call that 0. Now, for the second one, we are first of all going to remove that connection from the value of the Y position. And you'll see it's going to be down here, which is 0, 1, 2, 3. So we can go ahead and rename that to 3. Now, then we can connect the value 3 from the value array into its position. And we can now see if we change the value, it's going to be minus when it's going outside, which is the opposite. So we can add an expression to the position and then invert that value with a minus parentheses value parentheses. And now you'll see it's the same as the last ellipse shape. And then for this ellipse shape, we can do the exact same with the limits like we did before. Now, I think it's better for your learning if you do the other 4 ellipse shapes on your own, but note that you have to create a new ellipse shape and not duplicate it when moving to a new line. Now, for turning these dots into an actual shape, we have to add something called a convex hull. Now, I did tease this in the beginning and it might sound scary, but it's actually quite simple to use. And it's only really requiring 1 input shape or more. And we obviously have 6 input shapes that we want to use. So we can just drag in these ellipse shapes as I do here. And you'll notice that it starts creating this shape. And what it's doing is, as Cavalry Docs puts it, it's encompassing other shapes. So it's basically creating, in this case, an outline and then filling in that with its own shape. Now we can see that we now have this shape that we can move around using these values from the value array. Now before animating it, let's turn it into actually something worth looking at. And for that, we can enable the stroke on the convex hull and then set the width to 5 on that stroke. Then inside of fill, we don't want this gray color, and instead we can right click on the shaders and then add a gradient shader. Now, inside this gradient shader, we can change a few things. Starting with the mode, we can set to radial gradient, and then this white color, we can select it and then change the color to the green color, which has the hex code of 22FF and then 5D. Then we can hit enter, and we can then scale it up by holding Alt on one of these values, and let's set it to around 500. And then we can set the radius mode to fixed radius, along with the screen space being enabled to make sure that the whole gradient stays locked in place in the middle of the screen. Now, for this black color here, we actually want it to be sort of see-through, so we can start off by setting the color to the same as the background and then reduce the alpha down to 200. Now you'll see that with this gradient, it sort of has this strong color on the outsides and then a more weak color in the center. But to have this actually be transparent, we have to reduce the alpha down to 0 on the base color of the convex hull. The problem now is that we can see these circles behind it. So we sort of have to disable the visibility, and that won't actually break the animation. So we can just go ahead and disable the visibility like so here. Now, last step before animating this thing, we can add this cool effect on the edges of the convex hull. And to do that, we can add something called a filter. And more specifically, we want to add the inner shadow filter. And already it looks cooler, but we can do one thing, and that is changing the color. And for this, we want the exact same green color. And I originally tried making a connection between the gradient and this color, but you should not do this, since when I tried selecting the color from the gradient and then dragging the blue dot into the inner shadows color, it froze. So what you instead have to do is just to copy the hex code. And once you do that, you'll see that it looks quite nice, and we generally have the finished design, but we obviously haven't animated these values yet. But the overall gradient looks really good. Now, before we moving on, we can go ahead and select these two and drag them inside of the convex hull. And we can now move on to what I think is the most exciting part, the animation. And to start, we have to add something called a random behavior, which outputs a random value between a minimum and a maximum. And we want it to be between 0 and 400 for this, because inside of the value array, you can see it's maximum 400 and minimum of 0. Now for connecting this, we just want to drag in the random value for each and every one of these values manually. Now you will notice that they are all the same value. And this is actually quite simple to fix just by checking the use layer as seed. Now, changing the seed will actually see that we get completely different random procedural variations of this. Now, we can use the strength to, in the end, animate this. And it's quite simple to use, as 0% is going to make all values be 0. Now, how are we going to animate this? Well, first we can change the frame rate to 60 frames per second. And then we can set the frame to 60, and then we can add a keyframe at 100%. Then we can go to frame 0 and then set the strength to 0, and it will automatically add a keyframe. And you'll now see we have a quite boring animation, but we can highlight all keyframes and then hit Shift 2 to get some easing on it. And now you'll see that it's much better, but we obviously wanted to reset into the 0 position again, so we can copy that keyframe and then copy and paste it in 120. And we now have the base animation set up, but it's not done yet because we want this to continue a few times before then reverting back to the original. Now to do this, we first of all want to have a longer animation in our scene, so we can change the frame range as well as the playback range. Now this won't do the whole job, since we can see that the visibility of the layers are only up until 250. So to change this, we need to uncollapse all the layers and folders, and then we need to go ahead and select all the layers, as you can see I do here. And then clicking and dragging at the end here, we can drag it all the way to the end of this composition. Then we can actually just collapse all the folders and layers again, and we'll now have a longer animation, but it still will only repeat once at this point in time. So how do we do this? Well, normally what you would do would be just to select all of these keyframes and then go into Graph Editor and then select that looping. Now we actually want to use not loop after, but loop before. And this means that it's going to loop before these 3 keyframes and not after. So right now it won't loop since the keyframes are in the beginning. But this allows us to have a little break at the end where we can then have it reset back to the original color, which I'm going to explain further later. But for now, we just wanted to move it 120 frames for 1 repetition, then 2, then 3, and then 4 plus the last one. So now it will actually loop before these 3 keyframes. As you'll see here, it's going to loop a few times until it reaches the last one, and then it's going to stop. Now this is just the same exact shape every time, and we want to change the seed for every new repetition. So we can right click and then add a behavior called frame. But right now it's going to change at every single frame, which is obviously way too much. But that's an easy fix by right click and then add an expression. Then we can divide that by 120, so that every 120 frames it's going to change 1. And now we actually have a working animation, but we can take it one step further by adding a color change every time the shape changes. Now, to do this, we first of all want to add what's called a color blend, and this blends between colors, quite self-explanatory. And to use this in our animation, we want to disable the live mode, and then we can go ahead and double click the gradient shader to also have that visible. Now, as of right now, the green color is being determined by this color right here, but we want to override that with the color blend. And the way the color blend works is that at 100%, it's completely to the right on the gradient, and 0% is completely to the left. And we also want to control this inner shadow layer, so we can select that, double click it, and then drag that color blend into that color as well. Now, I do want to note that you can disable the color blend's control over the gradient and then set that to black, and it's going to look quite nice as well, but I'm going to keep it like this for this animation. Now, we can actually just delete those two from the view, so we now have the color blend only. And you can see we can actually add steps into this, so it's not just two colors, and then we can move it by increments each time a new shape is being shown on the animation. But before adding new colors, let's go ahead and change the black into this green color we had originally. Now, for adding new colors, we can go ahead and double click on the gradient, then select it, and we can now change the value to be 0.2 precisely on the gradient. And then we can go ahead and select it and then change the color to whatever we want. Now here I would encourage you to change the colors to be whatever you like, but make sure to maybe take the original color you had and input that as the hex code, and then drag the color wheel on the outside here to adjust the hue. And for this animation, I decided to go ahead and have 5 different colors, but the reason I'm adding 6 color steps is that the last one is going to be the first color again, the green color, as you can see here. Now, after we've done this, we can change the strength, and you'll see that it blends between the colors really nicely. And we can go ahead and try and animate this value. Now, starting from frame 0, we can add a keyframe at %0, and this means that we will start at a color of green. Then we can move 10 frames before the end of the first cycle, and then we can add a new keyframe again at 0%, and then move 10 frames to the right, and now we can increase the percentage to 20. And playing the animation now, you'll see that it stays green and then changes to yellow at the end. And this is quite nice, and we can now loop this animation by highlighting all keyframes and then going in and selecting the second one here, looping with offset. Then adding some easing with Shift 1, and you'll now see that if we play the animation, it does work, but there's something wrong with the timing, at least in my opinion. And if we take a look at where it changes color, I think it changes a little early. Now, to fix this, we can go ahead and select all the keyframes here, and then we can try moving it 10 frames along by first of all changing the playhead to be at frame 10 and then holding Shift and dragging the keyframes over. And when doing this, we'll have the color change be delayed by 10 frames. And choosing the method of looping before, we have allowed ourselves to have a little break at the end so it has time to change back to the original color. Now for the playback range, we can set that to a minimum of 610. And finally, you can also go ahead and add a number to the seed expression to customize the way the shape looks. And you sort of have to add at least 5 to change all shapes in your animation. And do note that because of the way the Convex Hull works, this won't really work for actual data and accurate representation of it, but it'll look cool. And that's it for this video. If you liked it, please make sure to subscribe. And if you want to support me even more, you can buy me a coffee. Links in the description. Thank you for watching.